This week, like every week, anti-Semitism has captured media headlines. Death to the Jews chants heard at Berlin rally. Anti-Semitic acts at 40-year high in U.S. has more than doubled for anti-Semitic display. Portland neo-Nazi rally reflects rising Israeli flag burned, fireworks, rocks thrown at fans at basketball game in Greece. These modern iterations of anti-Semitism are, of course, of concern to Israel's National Holocaust Memorial Museum, Yad Vashem. But it was yet another headline this week that caused Yad Vashem head Dani Dayan to speak out. Polish propaganda. Critics assail deal to resume Israeli youth trips to Poland. As a guardian against the distortion of Holocaust memory, in the past year, the Buenos Aires-born Dayan, who is a former head of the settler movement and a past Consul General of New York, Dayan has spoken up in several other cases, such as when Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban made comments this summer that evoked Nazi ideology. And Dayan says he sees results.
Here you have a scoop. 48 hours after I criticized Mr. Orban for his statement, I had a personal letter from President Orban in my desk explaining.
This week, days before Israel marks Yom Hashoah, the National Holocaust Memorial Day, I, Amanda Borschel-Dan, ask Yad Vashem head Dani Dayan, what matters now? Dani, thank you so much for letting me join you in your Jerusalem Yad Vashem office. It's raining outside. It's a beautiful winter day in spring. And I ask you, after a week in which we've heard anti-Semitic chants in Berlin, we saw a hugely anti-Semitic and very anti-Israel game in Greece, we have a new deal perhaps with Poland for school trips in this action-packed week. What matters now?
Well, first of all, that we are approaching Yom Hashoah, and that gives a context to all those things that you just mentioned. And this year, Yom Hashoah is the theme of the annual theme of Shoah remembrance is 80 years since the revolt in the Warsaw Ghetto and the Jewish heroism during the Shoah. And I cannot fail to remember every single time I think about it that even in the depths of the Warsaw Ghetto, there were two Jewish underground organizations. One, let's call it left wing, led by Mordechai Anilevich. The other, let's call it right wing, led by Pavel Frenkel. And even in the ghetto, they weren't able, because of their ideological or alleged ideological differences, to unite forces. And this is a lesson very relevant to these days, when Israel is confronting anti-Semitism, but also quite mighty adversaries, enemies in its boundaries, and even beyond. And there is a very worrying wedge in the Israeli society.
So you're saying to Israelis to take note of the wedge that was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and do you think that things would have happened differently had the Jewish forces been aligned?
No, of course not. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising was a way to die honorably. But the situation, of course, now is completely different. I'm not making any comparison of the circumstances in the ghetto to the circumstances in independent, sovereign, regional power, Israel. But the lesson is the same.
It's a lesson, obviously, that we've heard since biblical times over and over and over. And do you see, you, of course, were in politics and now you're in a non-partisan institution, but do you see that this lesson will ever be learned?
I hope so. We should educate. We should tell the stories that are relevant, even from the dark days of the Shoah. Again, without comparing the situation of the Jewish people then to the situation of the Jewish people now, which are completely different. But in this respect, I think it's equivalent.
As I just said, you're the head of a nonpartisan, non-political organization. And yet throughout the past year and some since we spoke last year before International Holocaust Remembrance Day, you have come out with some very strong statements which are not politically aligned, but are very forceful in the name of the State of Israel. One example I would say is, of course, what happened this past week in terms of the Poland school trips in which Yad Vashem, you, I assume, signed off on this or said it yourself, came out very forcefully against this new draft agreement.
No, I want to be much more accurate, much more nuanced with what you just said. The agreement has an annex. The annex is a list of recommended sites. I understand that those are recommended by the Polish side, that Israeli students should visit at least one of them. In the list, in that annex, there are indeed a few problematic institutions that shouldn't be there. But on the practical side, it makes no difference. No Israeli student, I foresee, will visit those places. And in fact, if we are talking, again, realpolitik, the missions, the trips that took place before the COVID pandemic will be exactly the same as those that will taken now. So I would say in the formal, in the declarative aspect, yes, we see a problem. In the practical side of the things, we don't see a real issue. And if we are posed with the dilemma, what is preferable to have those trips with that problematic declaration or not, I think it's a good thing we're going to have those trips.
You think exposing Israeli teens to the trauma of the Holocaust on the sites of the Holocaust is a good thing? I wonder as a mother if it's a good thing.
Well, when you use the word trauma, you imply that they will come back traumatized. I don't think so. I think that if the trips are carried with the proper preparation, as we, at least in Yad Vashem, do with the trips that we send, even of youngsters, of high school students, with the proper preparation, with the proper context, with the proper guiding on site, those are not traumatizing by highly educating trips.
And right now, we're, of course, in a situation in which many, many Holocaust survivors are leaving us in a rapid pace. And do you feel like this trip will fill the vacuum of that first-person testimony?
Well, we are really in a watershed moment in Holocaust remembrance. We are indeed, as you said, approaching rapidly, unfortunately, but also inevitably, the post-survivor era, the post-witness era, post-direct witness era. We will have, in that case, our task in Holocaust remembrance will be, on one hand, much more challenging, much more difficult, and on the other hand, much more important, much more vital. I fear, when that occurs, when we get to that stage, it will be the happy hour, quote unquote, of the deniers and the distortionists. And we will need a myriad of tools to confront that. The trips to the death camps in Poland are one of those means, but definitely not the only one. We will have to be much more creative, much more ingenious in doing that. But that said, I never forget that 6 million Jews never had the privilege to sit down in front of a camera and give their testimony because they did not survive. And therefore, we continue and even strengthen our gathering of documentation from archival sources. We have today in Yad Vashem, by far the largest archive in the world in Holocaust-related documentation, more than 220 million pages of documents, tens of thousands of artifacts and photographs, and etc. But we continue because, as I said, those are the testimonies of those that did not survive. Our last achievement, partially in following my meeting with Pope Francis in the Vatican, was that the church, the Catholic Church, opened for the first time in history their archives in the relevant period for our researchers.
The Catholic Church has opened its archives. Other countries are more closing their archives in a way, at least symbolically. Poland, for instance. Let's go back to Poland.
Before I tackle the Polish issue, actually the archives that are unfortunately close to us are the Russian archives. Mm-hmm. By the way, quite amazingly, the Ukrainian archives, we still continue to receive documents from copies of documents from the Ukrainian archives, even under the current situation. Unfortunately, that is not the case regarding the Russian Federation archives, and that's a pity. Regarding Poland, well, yes, we know the fact that the legislation and the limitations that exist in Poland regarding Holocaust research, and we don't accept them, obviously.
You said that the archive from Russia is closed. That surprises me. I actually didn't know that, because Russians are so proud of their role in liberating the Holocaust survivors. Why do you think it's closed still?
Well, I think that's a question you should address to President Putin.
Next time I see him, I will, for sure. But I wonder...
Please let me know his answer.
Okay, I will. So you don't know.
I would say an additional word regarding Russia. We see also problematic tendencies in the Russian education system regarding the Holocaust. We see, in some senses, a withdrawal to the Soviet era kind of education regarding the Great Patriotic War, including the Holocaust, that disturbs us, but we are monitoring it quite closely.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about Russia and Ukraine and the use of Nazi imagery. That during the beginning part of the war, the end of February, March, it was so rampant all over social media, all sorts of images, memes going through, really painting the other as the Nazi. Why do you think this is still such a touchstone for both of these people? Why this use?
Well, because the Shoah, the Holocaust, is still relevant. And I think it's even more relevant now than ever. I must say that what I call sometimes Holocaust awareness or interest in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, is growing and not diminishing as time passes. And one of the negative examples is the use of, as you said, of Shoah imagery and terminology in the propaganda war between Russia and Ukraine, mainly in the Russian side, but Ukrainians are not exempt of that blame. I had two altercations with the Russians following two problematic statements of Foreign Minister Lavrov. In one case, I believe the Kremlin spokesperson attacked me, but also invited me to visit Donbass to see by myself the alleged atrocities committed by the Ukrainians. In other case, I had a quite heated exchange of messages with a very senior Russian diplomat, but
one of the things that was said, if I'm not mistaken, is that Hitler had Jewish roots.
Exactly. That's one of the cases. And another case, Mr. Lavrov said that the West wants to implement a final solution to the Russian people like the Nazis did to the Jewish people. But also President Zelensky, a Jew himself, in the Knesset, in his Zoom address to the Knesset members, said, for instance, that Israel should assist the Ukrainian people like the Ukrainian people assisted the Jews during the war, during the Shoah, which obviously
wipes out all sorts of other history.
It's rewriting history.
Yes.
Because he doesn't really want us to behave like the Ukrainians behave toward the Jews. I must tell you, I visited Kiev in September 2021, before the war, for the 80th anniversary of the Babi Yar massacre. And I opened there an academic seminar. And in the presence of very senior Ukrainian officials and academics, I said, one, we welcome Ukraine into the family of democratic nations. 2, I express my gratitude that Ukraine, contrary to the Soviet Union, acknowledges the Jewishness of the victims. But I also said, 3, that there is an extra mile they must go, and that is to recognize, to look into their past and recognize widespread collaboration, Ukrainian collaboration with the Nazis.
They've been a bit busy since then, perhaps, and maybe that hasn't quite happened.
Well, now they have their own, they are busy with other problems, but we still see in Ukraine, like in other places, glorification of collaborators with the Nazis that are considered. In general, visiting Kiev for a Jew with a very deep Jewish historical consciousness is a very mixed feelings experience. On one hand, on one side, you see that they acknowledge the Jewishness of the victims in Babi Yar. There is a synagogue in Babi Yar and many other manifestations of that. On the other hand, I remember myself going down the steps from my hotel in Kiev to a very beautiful square with a huge statue of Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack leader that until Hitler probably was considered the most evil anti-Semite assassin of Jews in Jewish exile history. So it's a very troubling experience sometimes to be in Kiev. I would say that I see today in the world in Europe, 3 ways of confronting their past, their respective past of the nations. I visited for the first time in my life 2 countries, Germany and Austria. At very young age, I decided that I will not visit them. But now, as chairman of Yad Vashem, I decided to do it because, for the same reason I refrained memory, I thought that I strengthened memory by doing that. And for instance, let's take the Austrian case. Austria was a country that for decades after the war had the chutzpah to define itself as the first victim of Hitler.
With its Jewish leader as well, correct?
And now they recognize wholeheartedly that they were perpetrators. They completely reject the notion of being the first victims, and they admit they were perpetrators. I was in Lithuania, for instance. I met the leadership of Lithuania, also the prime minister and others that I did in Austria. And I found, for instance, there a young and committed leadership that really wants to make things right, but I'm not sure they have the political courage to do that. And in other cases, the most extreme probably is Belarus, where they completely deny. In Belarus, they even talk about the genocide of the Belarusian people instead of the genocide of the Jews.
And let's turn to Hungary as well. The Jobbik party that was such a rising force is now changing its tune and becoming at least less overtly anti-Semitic, but at the same time, we're hearing statements from Orban, which you addressed last summer.
Well, yes, I must say the Orban statement was not that you refer to, that I addressed, was not exactly anti-Semite. It was more about the racial tone, not necessarily against Jews. By the way, here you have a scoop. 48 hours after I criticized Mr. Orban for his statement, I had a personal letter from President Orban in my desk explaining. That shows the importance of Yad Vashem, because there were many critics. I don't think he sent personal letters to each one of them. But Yad Vashem is seen, and rightly so, as, I think, a moral beacon in this world.
You have to choose very carefully when you speak out and when you don't. How do you know when?
Well, I am in this business of media for many years in my different roles. I think that you acquire that instinct to know when you will overshooting, and Yad Vashem, as I said, as a beacon, as a symbol in this world, shouldn't react to every single thing that is said or done anywhere in the globe, but you have to understand the context and to choose carefully when to enter the arena and when not to.
Did Yad Vashem make a statement on the basketball game that happened? No. Because why?
Well, as you said, you have look. It was a terrible event. I saw the film, the clips. It was terrible. It was anti-Israeli. I don't think it was Shoah related. So no, I don't think that. But of course, as a human being, as an Israeli, as a Jew, I condemned it wholeheartedly, if you ask. But we didn't do that on our own initiative.
We are ahead of Yom Hashoah, as you said. And do you have any message for the many, many generations that hopefully will come out from these survivors? What is their role now?
Well, we are, as we already spoke about, in the approaching the post-survivor era, and the burden on the second and third generation will be huge. And I want to say a word of praise for the third generation, the grandchildren of the survivors. In many cases, obviously not in all cases, but it's quite a pattern that in many families, the first generation, namely the survivors themselves, didn't speak about their experiences. And the second generation, their children, didn't ask. And then came the third generation, and they did ask, and the grandparents responded. So in many cases, we owe the testimonies of the survivors to their grandchildren. That is a very peculiar experience, a very peculiar phenomena. We are very grateful to that third generation for doing that.
And now this fourth generation who hopefully...
Well, fourth generation we will still have to see and to wait and see what their role will be. But if we are talking about humanity in general, mankind in general, as we spoke already, anti-Semitism is rising. When I came to New York to serve as Consul General of Israel in 2016, I thought that anti-Semitism will be in a low place in my agenda. But during my term there, 15 Jews were murdered in anti-Semitic attacks in Pittsburgh, Poway, Jersey City, Muncie, 15. So it's clear that anti-Semitism, unfortunately, is rising its head again. Now, what I tell all the leaders that visit Yad Vashem or the leaders I meet in their capitals is that we are not in Germany of the 1930s. Thank God, we are far from it. But there is one difference between our contemporary generation, Jewish and non-Jewish, and the generation of the 1930s. And that difference is that we have the experience they didn't have. We know it can happen. Probably they thought, they burn books, that's bad. They burn synagogues, that's even worse. But they will never kill 6 million people. We know that anti-Semitism, if it's not confronted vigorously, forcefully, immediately, undefeated, can develop into monstrous dimensions. So we don't have the luxury, the privilege to say, let's wait and see how this thing develops. Leaders today have to confront anti-Semitism immediately and defeat it immediately before it's too late.
At the same time, there's huge fatigue for the Holocaust, for instance, in Europe. Definitely here in Israel, the kids of my children's generation are more tending to make jokes about the Holocaust than to treat it with any kind of serious respect. How do you combat that?
I don't agree that there is Holocaust fatigue. I think that Holocaust awareness is rising actually in the world. I will give you 2 or 3 examples. Holocaust International Holocaust Remembrance Day, January 27, didn't exist in the 80s or the 90s of the previous century. It was established this century. IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, didn't exist in the 20th century. It was established in the 21st century. A conference like the conference that the Prime Minister of Sweden, from all places, convened in Malmö in 2021 to talk with world leaders about Holocaust remembrance. Those were things that didn't happen in 20 or 30 years ago. I understand there's going to be a follow-up conference later this year in Toledo, Spain. So those things that didn't happen. Look, I meet leaders all over the world. In the last months, I had the privilege to meet in their capitals the Pope and Chancellor Scholz from Germany and Chancellor Niemeyer from Austria and President Macron from France in the Élysée and many others. And I see that this issue is in their agenda. Holocaust remembrance is today in the international agenda, and we help to put it there and to keep it there.
So you think that there should be some kind of trickle-down effect into the regular people?
That's the challenge. Leaderships are committed today. Does it trickle down to a certain amount? And, a challenge that sometimes people don't talk enough about it because they fear to cross a line and become politically incorrect is how to deal with Shoah remembrance and responsibility in societies, in European societies that are becoming increasingly multi-ethnic and multicultural. I told both Chancellor Scholz and Chancellor Niemeyer from Austria, Scholz from Germany and Niemeyer from Austria, that with German or Austrian citizenship, there are certain responsibilities that are linked to it, even if you're the grandfather of the citizen was not in Germany or in Austria, but in a different continent during the war.
Say Syria, with all the refugees from the Syrian war.
Yeah. So, by the way, they completely agree. And I agreed with Chancellor Scholz of Germany that the first satellite installation, the first educational center of Yad Vashem outside of Israel will be in Germany. We will take on our shoulders the responsibility to help Germany to educate its people regarding the responsibilities that the Shoah put on their shoulders.
When is that meant to take
we
off?
are in the early stages. It's a multi-year project. I hope it won't take too long, but for sure it will take a few years until
And it's meant to be a building or an educational project?
A building, a physical educational center. But I must tell you, I met the entire German leadership, Chancellor, President, Bundestag President, Minister of Finance, and others, and from the leader of the opposition, and all of them were thrilled about the idea and they committed to help it happen.
I'm just confused because they have so many educational resources already and Holocaust memorials. Why would they need Israel to help them?
Look, in this case, unfortunately, we have a unique perspective. We are the victims. The perspective that we have is completely different. When the institution that represents the victims comes to the country of the perpetrators, that's quite. First of all, it's quite a statement, and it's quite a difference from all other remembrance institutions. And we are talking specifically about education, an educational center, not a museum or not a memorial, but an educational center. I think it's very significant.
Earlier in our conversation, you talked about your trip to Kiev and how you welcomed the country to the group of democracies in the world. Now, as you rightly said, Israel is torn asunder by this fight for democracy. Do you see that your work will be affected by this perhaps infringement upon democracy that may soon happen?
I hope not. First of all, Yad Vashem, as you said, I put the moment I came to Yad Vashem a firewall between us and anything that is political. Not on anything that is moral, but anything that is political. We need very sharp instincts to detect where is the the line that crosses, that defines what is politics and what is morality. But, I hope that Yad Vashem's values will remain unchanged, whatever happens outside its walls.
Dani, thank you so much for giving me so much time today.
Thank you.
Pleasure. 1 year ahead of Yom Hashoah, my Israeli husband used the Shem Vener website to print out labels for memorial candles that burn for the full 24 hours of Holocaust Remembrance Day. 8 candles are wrapped with a label that includes the names and dates for 8 of his grandparents' siblings who were murdered in the Holocaust. About 100 of his family members were killed during the Shoah. Our children light them, each one taking stewardship for a lost relative. This year, Yad Vashem has opened up its database to Shem Vener, and this streamlines the ability to memorialize murdered family members at home. Check both of their websites for more details. This podcast was produced and edited by the Pod Waves. Have a comment about this or other episodes of What Matters Now? Email us at podcast@timesofisrael.com. Look for more What Matters Now episodes and subscribe wherever you find your podcasts. Until next week, Shalom.